So I'm Lynne Joyrich from the Department of Modern Culture and Media, and welcome back from lunch, everybody. I am sorry to report to people that Susan Bernstein, who is going to be speaking on synesthesia, cannot be with us today. But I am delighted to introduce my colleague, Phil Rosen. I had a long, elaborate introduction for Phil, which I've been told I'm not allowed to use, so I will not, and I will only say that here is Phil Rosen, who teaches in the Department of Modern Culture and Media, and he is going to be speaking to us about the cinematic. Here he is.
Okay. I'm not quite sure how to put this mic in this room with all the echoes. Let me know if there's a problem. Closer?
Talk loud.
Project.
Talk loud, like this.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm good at that. Okay. Cinematic, a topic that I chose many, many months ago when I've lived to regret. And so what's happened is, as I go through this paper or this presentation, you'll see that there's a lot about classical film theory, pre-1970 film theory in it. And I hope it's not just a kind of a dipping into classical film theory's greatest hits, but it sort of is. And I want to inoculate myself against a couple of weaknesses, or not weaknesses, I think, but potential problems, which is one of them is that the interior-exterior subject-object opposition is very strong in this paper, and that's partly because I see it in the text that I'm invoking. It's very strong, and from 1916 to 1960, one sees it at work. It's also, and these discourses are pegged onto a notion of whether cinema does or does not capture the surface of reality. That's not a sufficient definition of the cinematic with respect to actual practices because it leaves out animation, for example. Okay? Now, I think there's ways of getting around that, but it's certainly something I can't get into today. So I begin. Noting the time. Okay. Between 1894 and 1896, there appeared the first public exhibitions of something we now recognize as movies, films, cinema, light-projected motion images which were generated by an intermittent motion camera projector mechanism. Within a couple of decades, the word cinematic had appeared. As a part of speech, the word takes the form of an adjective, a modifier. Am I comprehensible? Okay. A modifier. But such seemingly denotative modifiers often open up into the realm of likeness, figuration, and rhetoric. Just consider possible uses of a kindred term, theatrical. In fact, there's a long history in film reviewing of denigrating a film because it's uncinematic. And in common usage, one can call cinematic something like passages in a novel or an operatic performance. So a novel can be cinematic and a movie can be uncinematic. So it's easy to see how quickly the term cinematic may slide into evaluation. If a movie is literary or theatrical rather than cinematic, isn't it better to go to the theater or read a novel? But when this type of slide happens, and it's an extremely common trope in the history of cinema, the adjective cinematic has an implicit specter backing it up. A technology or medium constituted by a kernel of something irreducibly itself. The existence of this specter is registered grammatically when the word cinematic is converted from adjective into noun. Behind the long-lasting, sometimes rigorous, and sometimes unbearably silly uses of the term cinematic, there appears the cinematic, the noun. What would it be to make this a usable, sustainable concept? As it happens, the question of, and quest for, the cinematic was one of the central themes in the history of classical film theory, roughly film theory before the 1970s. There is a lineage of classical film theory which produced what became an influential variety of canonical summary terms, phrases, and tropes to identify the specific qualities of cinema. For example, photogenie, montage, change mummified, the redemption of physical reality, and others. Today, however, identifying and delineating the cinematic may seem a dated project, for it goes much against the mediatic spirit of our own times. For the dominant contemporary emphasis is on mixtures and crossovers among various media. Possibly this critical emphasis is related to or conjoined with developments within cultural and political theory, as well as intensely heightened awareness of cultural hybridities associated with global flows of populations and cultures. But also, it often seems attributed to technological shifts, in particular the digital integration of the histories and practices of several media, which now can come into simultaneous play in individual works, within textual groupings such as popular genres or installation art, and in everyday practices throughout contemporary culture. Yet, read from our own historical moment and technico-cultural context, the tradition of classical film theory has attracted new attention. It seems to take on revised significance as we puzzle over both the persistences and the transformations of older mediatic signifying models and modules. So I will make some broad points about the cinematic as discussed in classical film theory. First, it must be remembered how new cinema was in the era of classical film theory. From its beginnings in the first decade of the 20th century right through its culmination, which Christian Metz located in the two-volume Esthétique et Psychologique du Cinéma by Jean Mitry in the 1960s. I once watched in the 1970s a restoration of Intolerance with Mitry. And I was sitting next to him, and he told me about scenes that he remembered from the Paris premiere, which he thought were not in it. But this is the culmination of classical film theory. That's how new cinema was during the era of classical film theory. So it is not surprising if a major tendency in classical film theory was to treat cinema as a new medium and a relatively new art form. Making claims for the cinematic as a specificity was a way of insisting on and interrogating the novelty of the new medium, even when it was often acknowledged by theorists and practitioners that it might draw unprecedented media and forms. As a baseline for this discussion that resides within classical film theory, take one type of logic that appeared early and with some lasting force. This was to reason from certain technical or technological characteristics of cinema to a claim for special experiences or possibilities in the realm of the aesthetic, but also tied to the psychological. This logic could be employed in the service of different kinds of aesthetic attitudes. Hugo Munsterberg's The Photoplay, a Psychological Study, 1916, propounds such a logic while supporting anti-modernist aesthetic proclivities on the basis of a neo-Kantian aesthetic and a conception of mental states informed by then-current psychology. A decade and a half later, in 1932, Rudolf Arnheim published Film is Art. Arnheim aligns the possibilities of the cinematic with modernist visual art, appealing to a neoclassical aesthetic heritage of distinctions of medias and genres, and emphasizing clarity, organization, and rationality of perception on the basis of the new Gestalt psychology. Interestingly, both describe the cinematic by beginning from film technology and the limitations it imposed on figuration and perception and representation of external reality. And these limitations are supposed to be what stimulates formal and aesthetic devices to make up for those lacks. In fact, both texts vehemently reject the idea that the cinematic is to be understood as visual registration or recording of the surface of objective reality in motion. They both argue that such an idea stultifies the medium. Even though both have sophisticated accounts of how the technology generates an illusion of movement of actual objects, they ultimately turn the cinematic towards the subject by asking how films generated by the new technology relate to and provoke a spectator's perceptual, mental, or subjective activities. The special possibilities and appeal of film and film aesthetics now lies in its capability for the imitation and/or the organization, not of exterior reality, but of perceptual and subjective states. In this line of thought, this is the value of the new technology. It is grounded less in representation than in subjectivity. That is, its aesthetics lay in the relation between machine and human, figured as the target of which is interiorized activity. I will make 3 extended notations about these limited but revealing examples from early classical film theory for conceptualizing the cinematic. 1, first notation. That's a little redundant. These examples illustrate how much the concern with the cinematic in classical film theory participated in a problematic that was broadly modernizing, no matter whether its aesthetic prescriptions were anti-modernist or something else. Both Münsterberg and Arnheim proposed to describe what was radically new about cinema and the implications of that radical novelty. Of course, the possibility of radical novelty is a foundational aspect, a foundational idea of the modern. It may be no coincidence that each book came out at a different moment of consolidation of formal and technical transformations in cinema, that is something new, generated by capitalist exploitation of the medium. The feature narrative film as the new standard product of a global industry in 1916, and sound cinema, and the consolidation of the cinematic avant-gardes in 1932 for Arnheim. More broadly, this suggests that classical film theory, and therefore the genealogy of the concept of the cinematic, may be understood within a lineage of discursive responses to a recurrent experience of modernity, namely the innovation, capitalization, dissemination, and formalization of new media technologies. Ever more rapidly produced cheap print texts, photography, phonography and radio, film, television, now digital media. In this sense, at least, classical film theory registers an awareness that remains pertinent now. For in our own period of media history, we can recognize plenty of claims for historical novelty and explorations of its consequences. The experience of and search for the new is now an old thing, but it continues anew. This may help explain why, even given the current emphasis on mixtures and hybridities with respect to the latest emergent media technologies and their predecessors, one may be drawn back into the problem and problematic of medium specificity. For it is part of this ongoing history. But now, when cinema is no longer the new global mass medium, as it was when Münsterberg and Arnheim were writing, the notion of the cinematic comes to our time as a strand in an old history. This history is not one of continual replacement by discarding old media, but instead seems accumulative. That is, so-called new media accumulate aspects of the old, reconfigured into modified and/or new technological and social configurations. Second notation. My second notation is to return to the move from technology to interiority in the Münsterberg-Arnheim logic of specification. Leaving aside for now the clear heritage of German aesthetics at work in both, I'll just note in passing that this move to interiority is often ideological, and I use that word advisedly. To a significant degree, anchoring the cinematic in a subjective interiority functioned as a strategy of legitimation for what was, after all, the new global, seemingly irresistible mass medium. In 1916, Münsterberg is quite explicitly responding to those who say cinema is socially harmful by saying it can be art. And Arnheim is trying to promote what we now might call best uses of cinema, which he sees it diverging from. In both cases, fictional cinema can become art, okay? But again, only by rejecting the idea that it solely records something, theater or performance. The cinematic must be shown to have its own aesthetic possibilities. In Münsterberg, it is very clear that he is defending a mass medium against bourgeois campaigns to control and censor it. But the move to ground the cinematic in interiority was widespread in very different types of film theory. And again, I note that there's a sentence that I've cut here that that in their kind of thinking, art is associated with interior effects, with some kind of interiority. In case anybody picked me up on missing a step there, I did. Okay. But the move to ground the cinematic in interiority was widespread in very different types of film theory. Take the most canonical and influential slogan for cinematically specific form, montage, which was foregrounded as a central cinematic concept, style, and slogan by some of the Soviet political avant-garde filmmakers of the 1920s. As a theoretical concept, the idea of montage was developed most profoundly and daringly by Eisenstein, first in his initial great flurry of films and theoretical essays of the late 1920s, and then in thousands of often unpublished pages of essays and books he wrote in the 1930s and 40s. But the more he unfolded the concept, the more it seemed to exceed the cinematic. Montage came to serve as the model or trope, not only for a huge number of filmic relationships, but also for cultural practices, and finally, the activity of human mentality itself. I'm leaving out a little passage of one of Eisenstein's ideas, which might concretize that a little bit in the interest of time. But I will note in passing that something like the move to interiority seems to have a shelf life after classical film theory, as in some elements of apparatus theory, film theory of the 1970s, and perhaps even slogans like "the brain is the screen." The latter conceives of the cinematic in terms of a certain materiality of thought in order to overcome the old subject-object opposition. But it is compared by Deleuze himself to Eisenstein, and so might be examined in light of this history. Perhaps the drive to subjectify or humanize the machine, or to technify the human, drifts into new technico-cultural contexts. The cinematic, then, might be seen as an instance of the following: the humanization of modern media technologies by means of available conceptions of subjectivity. I cannot go on, however, well, I can go on, but this is rhetorical. I cannot go on, however, without gesturing towards a countervailing tendency in classical film theory, which seems to situate the cinematic on the other side of the interiority-exteriority opposition, that is, in relation to exteriority rather than subjective interiority. Its most important and developed formulations occurred after World War II and became categorized with the sometimes fraught label of realist film theory. Bazin and Krakauer are the central examples, and both have important accounts of the cinematic. For Bazin, who incidentally explicitly uses the term ontology, so there is definitely a kernel, a residue, a kernel of something specific to cinema. For Bazin, the cinematic is associated with an unprecedented form of indexical technology whose product is received as the preservation of a fragment of the world in time, which he troped this product as change mummified. However, the importance of this form of indexicality still remains inseparable from a subjective component, namely posited by Bazin, namely a universal human desire to defeat time. That is, while he does not propose that cinematic form imitates mentality and that is its power, his logical premise that explains the importance and appeal of the cinematic is itself a subjective project, almost in an existentialist sense. This, for Bazin, is what motivates the desire, that is the moving force making cinematic technology so important as a provocation for engaging with the objective, with the exterior world. However, it seems to me it is Krakauer who takes such a move to the greatest extreme. In his 1960 theory of film, he uses the term cinematic like a judgmental blunderbuss. Krakauer asserts that that the properties of the medium, that's his term, quote unquote, make it most appropriate for recording and revealing things in the world. However, while noting the shaping and forming possibilities of filmmaking and condemning naive realism, he has little to say about the technology or technological mediations. Instead, and this is a move. All the other theorists I've mentioned have an account of cinematic technology. Krakauer does not bother. Instead, the cinematic in Krakauer is defined in relation to certain kinds of qualities of the world that film conveys better than any other medium or form. That is, cinema is most cinematic when it conveys certain subject matters, which are aspects of physical reality. Some of those aspects include physical states of objects in new or different conditions of presentation, movement, scale, and in those that can normally not be seen. Some of these qualities, he names them as the big, the small, the transient, refuse, the familiar. He proposes that there are 5 affinities of film. These affinities are for the unstaged, the fortuitous, endlessness, the indeterminate, and the flow of life. It might be objected that these privileged subject matters culminate in affinities which shade into a certain indefiniteness, but that is exactly Krakauer's point. The cinematic is what can offer the world as indefinite, loosened from the abstractions imposed by technological rationality. The cinematic provides a possibility of penetrating this second nature, this vast network of abstractions that intervene between us and the physical world. Krakauer even fuzzes over any strict definition of the foundational term for his entire theory, namely physical reality. Instead, he provides any number of terms that are also acceptable as substitutes or symptoms. The transitory world we live in, material reality, physical existence, actuality, nature, camera reality, or just life, quote unquote. Within the history of classical film theory, then, Krakauer operates with a different and I think pretty unique logic of the cinematic. Okay? De-emphasizing both technology and subjectivity, except insofar as it's collective, and I'll get to that in a minute. Right? He defines cinema in terms of what is outside cinema. When one defines cinema by reference to physical reality, the cinematic as an exteriority, okay? This means that the cinematic is defined by entities and histories that are exterior, not just to the subject. Exteriority is not just to the subject, but to the technology itself. For surely physical reality exists independently of the cinematic for Krakauer. Within this, what I've called the counter tendency in classical film theory then, any postulate of cinematic specificity necessarily includes the non-cinematic. Or we might say, for this tendency, the cinematic is constitutionally impure. Bazin formulates this with great complexity in an essay still not enough appreciated, which in English is called Towards an Impure Cinema, and was mistranslated in the original translation of Bazin as Towards a Mixed Cinema. Posed as a treatise on the place of literary adaptation in the history of film style, this essay is in fact an attack on the notion, which goes back to the 1920s, of absolute or pure cinema. In embracing cross-media adaptations, Bazin is suggesting that the objects put in front of the camera to be filmed have just as much a presence in the cinematic as any other factors promoted in the history of film theory or the avant-gardes, and that the specificity of cinema is to be unspecific. Oddly enough, in a very broad way, this bears a certain resemblance to descriptions of the contemporary media universe, which is said to break down or appropriate prior medium specificities. This brings me to my third and final notation. I think I'm going to make it, Adi. Among the constitutive impurities of cinema Bazin embraces is the following. Cinema is not just a matter of technology and film language. Cinema needs a public. Here, for what I'm about to say, we might as well call it a mass public. For all of the theorists conceptualizing the cinematic that I've mentioned so far evince awareness of the mass or the masses in some way or another. In his final chapter, Munsterberg agrees with the bourgeois fear of a power of the cinematic over the masses and finishes with a chapter on the need for films to evince a socially responsible moral pedagogy for the masses. Eisenstein is engaged in a deep, if sometimes wild, theorization of the emotional impact of ideas, which springs from a notion that the masses need to be led, and cinema is the great new mass form. Throughout his life, Krakauer had always studied the emergence of the modern masses, going back to the 1920s in Germany. And after the war, his theory of film defined the urgency of cinema's redemption of physical reality through ideas about the alienation of the masses and their loss of reliable, coherent ideologies in the welter of consumerist, technologically rationalized societies. Nowadays, the idea that the cinematic is implicated with the rise of the masses is best known through another writer from this period, that is Walter Benjamin, the artwork essay. Benjamin does not use the term cinematic, but this essay may be read as a construction of the cinematic as a technological response, not for subjective interiority, but to the irrelevance of subjective interiority. Hence, Miriam Hansen reads Benjamin's thesis that this technology rises in response to the desires of the masses to overcome distance as figuring the end of beautiful semblance, hence the aesthetic. While this thesis may be subject to critique, which, as we know, Adorno did not hesitate to formulate, essentially for the rest of his life. However, it is worth foregrounding here because it suggests the following hypothesis. The cinematic, which seems to be a technological or aesthetic concept, has been a terrain on which intellectuals and artists conceive of and fight out their conception of the masses, as well as their own relation to the masses, as well as the masses' relation to the world. They do this whether as leaders or followers or through a desire to be members of the masses. The turn to subjective interiority and the aesthetic and classical conceptions of the cinematic, and the turn to exteriority and anti-aesthetics and other theorists may be read as moves in this game. I suggest, as a beginning of thinking about this, I suggest we think about three broad schemas, okay, of the masses as we read such accounts of the cinematic. The first is what we may call the Le Bon Freud approach. The cinema audience, representative of the masses, is subject to coalescing as irrational collectivity through identification and emotion. We can find this idea in both simplistic, socially defensive modes, a la Munsterberg, and in theoretically complex and productive modes throughout the history of thinking of the cinematic. And it's probably associated, I haven't thought this through, but it's probably associated with most, if not all, of the moves to subjective interiority. Second, there is something I might call the directional mass, whereby an intellectual or filmmaker proposes to engage the cinematic from awareness of the directionality of the mass. At its most interesting, one finds this conception of cinema as mass in Benjamin, as I've just mentioned, but it also appears in other leftist thought. For example, in third cinema theory, in certain strands of post-colonial theory, when it engages with cinema. The third schema is to conceive of the cinema audience as an unformed, shapeless mass, which may temporarily coalesce in socially productive or unproductive ways. Krakauer was certainly aware of the Le Bon Freud approach, but in his theory of film, he celebrates the possibility of the indefinite, which extends to the unpredictability and formlessness of the mass, and Simmel's accounts of the urban masses were probably always important to Krakauer. As Gertrude Koch has suggested in Conversation, the mass in its unfinishedness is thus an especially appropriate object for filming in Krakauer's conception of the cinematic. Okay? Hence, Miriam Hansen, drawing on later Frankfurt School work, has argued that the mass in this sense offers the possibility of alternate or oppositional public spheres that can form temporarily around the pleasures of films and the cinematic. What of the cinematic now? Nowadays, seeing a film is not necessarily pegged to the gathering of large numbers of people in a public space. This is just one option among many at a moment when it's possible that some people might see Gravity on their cell phone. Okay. It happens, it really happens. In some places in the world, that's the only way to see it. The move from public collective viewing to the option of notionally privatized viewing on small screens was prepared by the inception of the television monitor as a key medium and became a kind of an important medium for film viewing, among other things, in the second half of the 20th century. With computerization, films may now be disseminated by means of a distributed network. Hence, intellectuals and artists' conception of the mass are in transformation again. One need only think of the Hart-Negri attempt to align distributed media networks with the political notion of the multitude, and Galloway's critical cautions about the ideological, disciplinary, and control aspects of distributed networks. This is a media universe in which the aesthetics of the cinematic may seem irrelevant. Where in the digital realm is the assumption of indexicality and exteriority, or deep subjective interiority? Where are the great public spaces where the masses physically coalesce, where the large screen quasi-allegedly hypnotic fascinations of the moving image with sound are deployed? One answer is the following. The cinematic still exists, but it is deployed as code in more than one senses of the term. Yeah. For example, it is common to say that cinematic indexicality is technologically obviated by the digital, okay? Yet somehow, cinematic indexicality still seems to function as such within the digital world. One indication is the new status of fragmentation. As Jean-Louis Comolli argued recently, there was a time when cinematic fragmentation, a la Vertov and Eisenstein, could be treated as politically and critically definitive of the possibilities of the cinematic. But nowadays, such fragmentation is the problem. The media universe is one that seeks to cut the world into tiny, commodified, globalized bits and overwhelm us with a constant flood of such bits. Okay? And fragmentation, logically, becomes a dominant style of mainstream, highly capitalized cinema. Yet, over the past 20 or more years, we have seen the rise of a critical cinema, which we might call slow cinema, a cinema of long takes and intense awareness of physical environments. Okay? This is not just opposed to the temporality of commodified fragmentation in a global way, but often becomes what we might call a situated cinema. Whatever the differences among such filmmakers, and there are many more than this, but let's say Kiarostami, Bellatar, Elias Suleiman, Hu Xiaoshen, many others, their cinematic, the cinematic in their films, is one that implicitly seeks to oppose the cinematic of the fragment from specific geopolitical points and spaces in the world. Such insistence on situatedness, filmic situatedness, is only imaginable if indexicality is coded into the films, even after the old cinema technologies have disappeared. Perhaps there is still potential critical weight in the cinematic, even in the age of globalized digital media universe. Thank you.
So on the way to becoming a political concept.
You have a mic?
On the way to the cinematic becoming a political concept, I wonder if you would address, in a way, the kind of harnessing of the cinematic to the visual world, or in a way, the assumption that the cinematic, I know what the roots of the word are, that's not the problem, but how the cinematic is actually defined by the visual world. The visual world, which then can replace, for example, the sound world. If you mention Arnheim, for reasons that are obscure to me, clearly, through a very long life, agreed with that move. I mean, that identification of the cinematic and the visual, Miriam Hansen clearly did not. So is that an ideological move? Does it become a political, in a way, assumption that this identification of the cinematic with the visual?
Yeah.
And why does the sonic get left out?
Okay, well, a quick comment with respect to Arnheim, which is as much as Münsterberg should be regarded as a neo-Kantian aesthetician, insofar as he was an aesthetician, Arnheim should probably be referred to Lessing. Okay, that is the integrity of the separate perceptual registers was very important to the way he thought of the virtues of art. He did say that they could be combined, right? But this would have to go against what he saw as a universal desire, which is very close to what Bazin saw as a universal desire, which is a desire for the complete reproduction of the world in all its perceptual registers. And the problem, a la Gestalt psychology, was precisely to clarify things for him. Now, so you're quite, I'm sorry, I got that, that was the part that I had to leave out of my paper, so I got it in. But can you give me a preface of your question again, please? The part of your question that you really wanted to ask, not the one I answered. Yeah.
It has to do with the sonic as being absent when the cinematic is identified with the visual, which seems to me the dominant practice, but not the sole practice.
Right. No. I'm trying to think of how to answer that economically. I mean, the first, number one, I agree with the question. And I think that this is something that identifying the cinematic with the visual persists into our own time. One just need to think about the emergence of visual studies PhD programs, right? Whereas clearly it's the it's the combination of the two, which is how film is experienced, right? I think that said, right, everything that I had to say in my last couple of pages about the cinematic applies, right? I mean, the cinematic ideally, would be conceived as in terms of sound-image relationships. There is a theoretical heritage of saying, yes, but the dominant forms prioritize the image in certain kinds of ways. We don't think that's the aesthetics of the dominant, okay? But I think you're right to raise the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. The first one was a clarification. I wasn't sure that I understood where you were situating Deleuze vis-a-vis, I mean, you talked about pre-1970 classical film theory, but then you made a couple of references. So if you could clarify that a little.
Yeah. Okay, my original idea was to say, look, there's some odd kinds of subterranean persistences of some of these ideas, even in the period after which there was supposed to have been a break with them, right? And so, I'm not at all saying that that Deleuze is out to save cinema by some kind of reference to subjective interiority, okay? But that it remains a problem that he's trying to get around, Okay, so he kind of like tries to dissolve the subject-object opposition, for example, right? Which that, you know, which I suggested so much of that earlier theory rests on, right? And yet there's this odd kind of trace, you know, why do you have to say the brain is the screen? Munsterberg would have said the mind is the screen is the mind, okay? And obviously there's a more materialistic kind of, that is a Deleuzian materialism, that is kind of view of what the brain is and so forth, as opposed to the mind. But nevertheless, I see some kind of odd kind of comparison there in terms of the logic of how one thinks about film.
Right. I mean, because I guess I would read him as precisely making the formulation of the cinematic in terms of interiority versus exteriority, making that precisely, problematizing that beyond any useful use of the terms. I mean,
Yeah.
I would want to go that far with Deleuze.
I agree, but when he says that, you know, well, first of all, I don't think the cinema, you know, the cinema books have all sorts of like absolutely brilliant things about specific films and theorists and so on and so forth, but in the end, I don't think they're about film, you know. So you know, they're a philosophical text in certain ways that takes film as its major example. But when he begins by sort of breaking down the idea, you know, that images only exist either in a picture or a mental images, but that the universe is images, you know. There is that, you know, again, you know, and Munsterberg says, well, the formal mechanisms and strategies that have now been developed by the new Griffith feature film, you know, there's an equivalent to attention, there's an equivalent to memory, there's an equivalent to imagination, there's an equivalent to emotion, you know, and that's why the film is so. There's this odd kind of attempt, you know, to bring human apprehension of things into some kind of identity with the film. And in the case of Munsterberg, it's subjective interiority. I would never say that's what Deleuze is after.
Okay, the other question I had was sort of more speculative, or asking you to be speculative. The closing pages, I very much like the way you were suggesting retaining the cinematic beyond indexicality. So what I wondered was, how does the other side, those who wouldn't want to retain the cinematic, how do they then refer to the question of what you're still suggesting is called the cinematic? I mean, you know, is there anything other than the technological? Is there a conceptual framework, that is to say, that you see as being invoked that is supposedly surpassing the cinematic?
Yeah. There is a conceptual framework. I do tend to see it as, and ironically, as a reprise of a kind of a technologically grounded approach. I do tend to see it that way. There are those, I think, and I'm trying to call to mind, you know, it's like I'm almost tempted to take the fifth. I'm trying to call to mind who I would be thinking about, but it has to do sort of almost with quantity of flows on the one hand, I think, and interactivity on the other. The constant capability of reshaping, reprogramming, right, is, I suspect, where they would go. But there may be people in the audience who have a better idea or are more committed than I am, you know, to that kind of argument.
Thank you, Phil. I love this idea of, well, this is what I take you to be arguing, that the indexical is in fact the cinematic, and not only that, but that the indexical is the political, in fact, of the cinematic. And I wonder if you would, I mean, I suppose my question really is are you going that far? How far are you investing in the, in the indexical as the political of the cinematic?
Okay, I've written a little bit about the indexical elsewhere. Let me just try to make a very quick point about that. For me, it's very important to argue that the indexical is not technological. The indexical is a social or cultural commitment to regard certain kinds of images precisely as indexical, which becomes one of our cultural dominants, it seems to me, with the onset of photography, phonography, cinema, and television, with liveness in television, for example, okay? But it involves a broader commitment, such that when you can argue that the technology is no longer indexical, right? Which this is a pretty complicated point to make. But even if you agreed that, let's say, digital video is not indexical, nevertheless, it can function as indexical, okay? So that's number one. So it's not technologically determined.
Yeah.
Determined by cultural assumptions about the subject, assumptions that spectators and makers make, okay? The second thing is, I think I want to be a little bit more cautious than the way you put it. I would not, in the end, identify the cinematic with the indexical. To court, that's all. Call me Andre Bazin, you know, that's not exactly where I'm going, okay? But at a certain historical moment, okay, the persistence of indexicality, okay, or of the indexical function, even in digital media networks, right, is how this heritage of the cinematic is currently important, okay, to integrate into the overall media networks, okay? It provides a kind of an opportunity for a kind of politically critical function. And my point was precisely to historicize. There may have been a time when fragmentation was politically oppositional. You know, you break up the world into bits. This was Vertov's ambition. You know, you break up the world into bits and reform it in ways that shows, you know, that something else can happen. Something else, you can remake the world. Okay, but now fragmentation may be the problem. Okay, so that there was a time when the capabilities of fragmentation may well have risen to the top of characteristics that were encountered as cinematic, okay?
Okay, so then I just have a quick follow-up, and it's actually partly piggybacking, is that a word? On piggying back on on something that David said, which is the relationship to Deleuze, because I also heard, I think, Deleuze would read Deleuze as much more in line with the kind of Krakauer sort of narrative of the cinematic than I think that you are. I mean, you said in response to David's question that Deleuze's books may have a lot of things that interesting to say about certain films, but they're not about film, which I agree. But are they then about the cinematic, understood in the Krakauian sense, of something that, I mean, it's already an indexical concept, the cinematic, as you're framing it through Krakow. And then I sort of I wanted you to also then clarify the sense that you're not interested at all in a poetics. I mean, in a poetics of cinema. That does not seem to be part of this particular project at all. Is that correct?
There's two more questions I'd like to take the fifth on. In terms of Deleuze, that's very interesting, what you say, I think, about whether he's about the cinematic. My first, and I would have to think about that a long time, Okay. My first instinct is to say that there's a way in which Deleuze might be read as dissolving the cinematic. Precisely because it's not about cinema in certain ways, right? It's a kind of a demonstration of precisely of the of how one can conceive of a universe and a discourse, and discourse may be the wrong word, but without all of these kinds of these older distinctions. Okay, you know, I would really that's a very troubling question to me, and I would have to think about it some more. I'm not, and I'd have to go back and look at Deleuze and think about that. So I'm not sure about that. In terms of a poetics, insofar as, you know, one, you've really done it to me this time. In terms of a poetics, I don't think it necessarily means there's no interest in poetics. I think, for example, when I talk about slow cinema and the long take, I can imagine a kind of explication of it, you know, which would be a poetics. But I don't think a poetics can be just that. Okay, and because there's always this underlying question that was which was first raised by Benjamin, okay, about about whether the notion of semblance, right, whether the notion of semblance makes sense within a mediated universe or not. The notion of semblance as imagined. Okay, in classical German aesthetics, okay, shine, beautiful semblance, the beauty, the beautiful, and that's always a question. Now, I experience lots of films, especially these slow films, as entrancing and beautiful. Some people experience them as frustrating and irritating, you know, but I can imagine a poetics. I can. Right. I guess that's the short answer. I'm having trouble articulating why that's the case, except that I think the cinematic may imply poetics. I'm not, you know, even as it challenges the older aesthetics, it might imply older aesthetic theories. It might imply a poetics.
So just to give a sense of where we are, Avi's in line, and
Elizabeth. Can you have a mic?
Thank you. You started with speaking about the theatricality of the cinema, the cinematic aspect of theater, and I would like to start my question from there. It seems that
The mic should be closer, not further.
it seems that every form of art has this feature that it gives itself to metaphors that applies elsewhere. So we have the theatrical, the pictorial, the photographic, the poetic, etc. And you just use it. And when we use this, we imply that we know what is the essence of the theatrical or the cinematic. There is, as if we know what it is to be theatrical or cinematic. So your quest about the cinematic is actually an example of something that is characteristic of all the art. And this is, I think, especially interesting from in the other way. What remains of the cinematic, you're asking, after all these changes, both in theory and in technology? And you insist that there is something there that remains. I don't know if it remains the same, if it has always been this, or this is what is essential today. So I'm asking here two questions. Is this essence essential to the cinematic, historical or trans-historical, and this is the easier question. The other question
You
is...
can stop
is-
now.
No, but what really intrigues me is what is it about those arts that in every art we have the same quest to retain something essential despite all the changes. So, for example, in painting, so after photography, for example, people search for what is still essential to painting, and the same with the literary and the poetic, etc., etc.
Yeah. I think, first of all, yeah, my argument is that this is historical, and I think it's very important here to remember that having gone through some of those loose common uses of the term, and I said, for example, you can do the same thing with the theatrical, but I then asked something else, which is there some kind of more productive or useful conceptualization of the cinematic, right? Late in my paper, I suggested, and this I think is, I suggested that one of the things that one might want to bring in to the cinematic, right, is awareness of the masses. That cinema was built and conceived originally as a commercial medium and rapidly, with extraordinary rapidity, became a global mass medium. 20 years after the first films are shown, cinema is a global mass medium, right? It's quite extraordinary. So one thing about cinema is that it emerges on the heels of the emergence of the masses into cultural and political consciousness. It's post-French Revolution, right? It's the age of mass markets, advertising, so forth. So the history of cinema, the historical emergence of cinema seems to me to be different than all these other arts. I mean, if you want to say there's the painterly exists in the Renaissance and French Impressionism and in the latest, in a Jasper Johns painting or something like that, that's fine. But I was asking, is there some kind of rigorous way that would be useful, thinking about it? And so that was why I proposed that the cinematic is a terrain in which, throughout its history, when one thinks about the cinematic, maybe we should read it in terms of relation of intellectuals and artists to the masses. You posit an entity called the masses. I don't say what they are, even whether they really exist, right? But they exist in the mind of these intellectuals and filmmakers, right? And so one is always, maybe projectively, but there's a relation there. And so when one tries to define the cinematic, one is always on that arena. And, I guess one could say that, theater archetypally begins as a kind of communal space, it's collective, and one can say that. But we're talking about the modern masses. We're talking about modernization. We're talking about industrial modernity. That's when cinema comes up. And so that, that seems to me to confront a slight, and it might be that every art has its own way in which you have to go at how its kernel is defined in that history, right? Okay, but so that seems to me to be a little bit different about cinema and the cinematic.
So I also had I'm interested in the question of indexicality, and maybe naive about kind of the most recent sort of film theory, but I'm curious about this idea that digital media are not indexical media. So in my thinking about indexicality, it seems materiality seems to have an important role to play, the kind of material relationship between the representation and the thing that's being represented. A kind of particular kind of causal relation that one way that I might, or that you might think about it is kind of causal relation that sort of bypasses subjectivity or something like that. Anyway, we often think of the digital as a kind of virtual space, right? And so that it kind of has, that it's lacking the kind of materiality that film might have. So, but it's not clear to me why that would be, why one might think that, right? So in film, the representation is created through the arrangement of silver halide crystals, whereas in a digital medium, it's created through the particular state of a vacuum tube or molecules on a transistor, right? There's also a material substrate in which the information is encoded. It's a different material substrate. It's one that exists on a smaller, right? Especially in the case of transistors, right? Those require quantum physics to understand how transistors work. So it's a different physical stratus, substrate, and it's perhaps a smaller one. But it's not clear to me that it is fundamentally different, at least. So I was wondering if you could kind of address that. And in particular, I was thinking about, with respect to your claim about the masses, which I think is kind of a fascinating thought. And it seems to me that this virtual space is particularly good at engaging the masses, right? So I'm particularly thinking about the role that social network technologies have played in, for example, the Arab Spring, or that the masses are particularly engaged in virtual space. And maybe it's true that the kind of material doesn't play quite the same role, but it doesn't seem to me that the material is kind of is not a part of the process, right?
Yeah, okay, so two points. The first one on the digital. I sort of agree with you, but I'll tell you what the argument is. The argument is that when you have the electrons on the chip and so forth, right? That you say that's the materiality that and transistors and so forth in the chips, but that they are coded as numbers, right? They're coded as algorithms, okay, and that they
the
are.
The algorithm is already on a different, right? The algorithm is the software. The hardware is material stuff.
Well, there's an argument. I mean, my colleague Wendy Chun has made some very interesting arguments about the software-hardware distinction, and the fact, the way that it actually hides a lot of sort of exactly the materiality of the processes, I think. And so I don't want to go there. I don't want to try to reproduce her argument here, but I just want to say that that distinction is a very common sense, everyday commercial distinction. We get sold software, so it must be different than hardware, right? There's lots of different kinds of software that we can all put on the same hardware, but there may be questions about that. But that the fact, this is the argument is, or the original argument was back in the 1980s when everybody was gaga, the original argument was that this disrupts indexicality in the physical, okay? Because numbers are regarded as a universal abstraction with respect to any concrete entity, okay? That this is a kind of a conception, of a general conception of numbers. Math, math can be applied to anything or depart from any concrete thing and just go off on its own, right? And it also makes possible a kind of an infinite manipulation. The numbers, the ease with which numbers can be manipulated can result in making an image into something completely different. Okay, this was the argument. So that unlike photography and film, where this can be done, but it takes a lot of physical work and chemicals and stuff, and it's very, very, a lot of intensity. Okay? So that was the argument. With respect to the masses, I think there's a line in the virtual masses. I agree with you up to a point. I mean, part of the trajectory, however, of the cinematic in terms of the masses, and the reason why the masses become a site of contention now with respect to the cinematic, is that the relation of the cinematic to the masses was originally conceived in terms of public spaces, collectives, people coming together in a movie theater or on town squares or wherever, to lots of people coming together. So there was a collectivity, there was the image of the crowd, in all of this, right? Once you get TV and the small screen, it's possible to conceive of viewing as becoming more and more privatized because the small screen becomes an element of the home, which is ideologically a private space as opposed to these public spaces, okay? Then when you get, like cell phones, okay, it becomes completely individualized anywhere, right? Okay? So in fact, the distributed network actually separates individuals out in the mass, as each one has their own viewer. And I suspect that part of the force of the Arab Spring, let's say in Egypt, right, was that the cell phones were used to collect people in Tahrir Square, so that they became a public collectivity. It was a public space. It became a kind of alternate public sphere, right? The cell phones were a means to bringing individuals together back into a politically effective collectivity, which could be, ironically, which could be shown on the network. Part of its force was that it was a global image of thousands and thousands of people coming together. Right? So those are some comments on your question.
I'm not sure whether this question's already been asked and whether, therefore, you've already answered it, but it does have to do with the relation. Well, I'm not sure it's a relationship between the cinematic and the masses. So are the masses then interior? And I think this is going back a little bit to what Adi was asking before, whether we want to conceive of the cinematic as a concept or as a historical, or something that is modifiable historically. Because the masses seem to, in your narrative, certainly to be that, modifiable historically, right? And then you have the three models of the Le Bon Freud model, and so I guess that is, I think, is my question, whether what the relationship between the cinematic and the masses are. Are they one of interiority or exteriority? In other words, are the masses, is the cinematic constitutive of that, or is it a reflection of something else? In other words, the necessary medium by which then...
Yeah. Well, cinema is not the necessary medium by which the masses are constituted, but I think, the answer to your question depends on who you ask. And it might be, you'll get a different answer from both Munsterberg and Krakauer, who just hammer home the interior-exterior opposition, to the point where it's almost unbearable. If you ask Munsterberg, he'll say it's an interiority, and that's the problem, is that cinema is so effective that it can move the masses in a certain way because it's got all of these capabilities of modeling the mind. And so that's why his last chapter is about social pedagogy, right? And I'd put that in the Le Bon Freud category, right? I think Krakauer is pretty radical in that regard, and it's precisely because he's got this odd kind of heritage of Simmel and to some kinds of Marxism, and he's a friend of Benjamin. For Krakauer, it's crucial that the world pre-exists the cinema, okay, and that cinema find ways to display that. And this is a little bit like Bazin, okay? So for Krakauer, it's the indefinite stubbornness of the masses. It's not a masses that has to be organized and led by cinema. It's a masses that is acknowledged and sometimes registered by cinema in that indefiniteness. It's this kind of stubborn, this stubborn residue. Which, and in terms of relations of intellectuals to masses, it's an acknowledgement, of the force of this, and the masses itself is a concept, by the way. So yeah, okay.
I'm going to add myself in here really quickly, and then it's Elizabeth, and then Bonnie, and then I think that we. How did you do that? Why don't I put you? Very quickly, probably because I'll burst into coughing before I can get it out. I think that what you were saying, Phil, about the way in which these debates about thinking about the cinematic as either internal or external actually were ways of trying to conceptualize the masses, that these were all moves within a way of thinking about the masses, is actually incredibly interesting, and I think that the kind of key thing, and to me, you know, as somebody who works on the televisual, that is also very much about the way that these are on the border, always kind of theorized as being on the border of the internal and the external, right? Both in terms of subjectivity, but the way it relates to society, or with TV, as you were saying, that it's already privatized in the home, but it ties you to public sphere. And then with things like cell phone video, even more so, that, you know, it's individualized, but yet it brings people in the street, so that there's always a kind of articulation across the kind of external and the internal. And it's precisely, it seems to me like that's exactly what's at stake, because how that relationship, how they're seen as connected or disconnected, is then what either allows the masses to be figured as, let's say, feminized, or as, you know, unthinking, or maybe as always ready to action. It seems like the different ways that different thinkers think about that relationship is exactly then the way they link the media to politics. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but it seems like that's exactly the pivot point that allows that articulation between mediation and politics. So again, I don't know if you had any comment to that, or...
No, I would just, no, I don't. I think you're right. And I would just say that I have, you know, in terms of the interior-exterior opposition, I'll just put in a parenthesis. Every theorist that I've mentioned, you know, like even Munsterberg, who so hypostasizes interior, you know, subjective interiority, you know, has an account of exteriority in his terms, what he would call exteriority. But so it's a matter of emphasis, but what becomes foundational, you know, for his account of cinema, and therefore this relation to the masses, is interiority. Yeah. Microphone.
For people outside the discipline, could you just quickly clarify the difference between indexicality and referentiality? And then you said that indexicality, you're thinking of indexicality not as technological, but as a social consensus. There's a certain social decision around indexicality, and I wonder what you think that decision is. I mean, you weren't here this morning when I said I don't believe in reality, so it's like I would really be interested to know how you think about the indexical decision.
Right. Okay. A quick answer would be, to the first question, would be the following. There may be lots of kinds of signs that assert referentiality. Okay? An indexical sign is one that's formed by some kind of existential connection to that which it refers to, right? And so when the rereading of Bazin began, which I participated in a couple of decades ago, one of the hypotheses was that Bazin proposes that indexicality has special force in appealing to us as bringing us the real, okay? And so photography and then film as visual media are, you know, they kind of, there's kind of different forces of referentiality in different media, different forces of, but film is the most indexical and therefore makes the strongest appeal of giving us the real, okay? Could you just repeat your question about reality so I can tell you what reality is?
You said you're thinking of the question about reality.
Yeah, repeat the question.
The question is about indexicality.
Okay.
So
right.
What is the current social consensus about indexicality?
Right. I don't think...
Because I think it's very different from a earlier historical indexicality.
I think that's right. No, I think that's right. But I think also you have to, you know, when you go through that succession of, you know, this constant kind of appearance of new media in capitalist modernity, you know, going back to cheap print, but then photography, sound recording and distribution, film, TV, radio, TV, digital media, okay? what happens is that there's this kind of proliferation of indexicality in everyday life in a way, in images and sounds, perceptual indexicalities, in ways that we haven't seen before. And so it emerges as a kind of a model, okay, of what it is to capture reality.
I think it destroys reality. I mean,
You think it what?
I think indexicality is a defunct term. I've had this argument with other indexicalists.
That's indexicologists.
This is a speculation. I'm speculating that indexicality is gone.
But it can't also be gone with reality, Elizabeth. You either have reality or indexicality, right? No?
Well, here's my
what's
thing.
the opposite of...
Here's my thing. I think that politics involves making claims about the real. One may spend all sorts of time sort of demonstrating how that's a construct or can be deconstructed or is problematic in all sorts of ways. But when a moment comes for political action, there's an imaginary of dealing with the real, okay? And it seems to me to be a function, it seems to me personally, this is not theorized, not anything, it's just a confession. It's a confession. I believe that politics demands an assertion about the real, okay?
Yes, but is that real indexically
so what I was going to say was and it's quite possible, there's a very good argument, to be made that this kind of fragment, the explosion of a globalized mediated world into small commodified fragments, must make us aware and cynical of everything, right? But that's at a moment, my suggestion was, when some of the filmmakers I mentioned reactivate the indexical in a new context with their slow cinema, with their insistence that this film is situated in a given geopolitical spot on the world.
And it's totally nostalgic and romantic.
It's an insertion. It's a critical insertion into the globalized media universe.
This goes back to the region.
I think it all depends on what the opposite of indexicality is. I mean, it's another question that I had for you, Phil. I mean, sorry, Barney. I mean, what's the opposite of the indexical, or what's the alternative to the indexical? And I just think I completely take your point, Elizabeth, but I just think that it all depends on what we're substituting for the indexical for.
Depends first before on what we're substituting for the indexical, what we're even defining it. If I understood Phil correctly, it sounds like you're in a way redefining it away from a purely technological definition to a definition of almost a kind of reading practice, a kind of commitment. Yes. This could be a totally fascinating conversation that hopefully people will have on the break, but we are almost out of time, and I want Bonnie to be able to get her last question in, and then maybe you can all continue it during the break. But
Okay.
yes, Bonnie, last word.
That's almost my question. I'm just picking up on a couple of things that you mentioned.
Could you push the mic a little closer?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So I just want to pick up on a couple of things you mentioned, just to ask you a couple of questions. So one is that you talked a few times about the public that's assembled by cinema as the masses, for talking about that particular historical moment where it's spoken of that way. And I was remembering the line from Dialectic of Enlightenment where Horkheimer and Adorno contemplate the desirable possibility of destroying all the movie theaters because of all the damage that cinema does. And they say, yeah, that would be a great idea. Oh, wait, except for the housewives and the homeless who need the movie theaters as a place to hide. The housewives get refuge from the violence of the domestic, and the homeless need it for coolness in the summer and heat in the winter. So I wanted to invite you, thinking of that, to sort of nuance the language of the masses a little bit, as they do in that moment, and also to think about the materiality of the movie theater as informing our idea of the cinematic, but not necessarily belonging to our idea of the cinematic. So that's one sort of nest of questions. And then the other, I don't mean that to be big, but I am really interested in the materiality of the movie theater as kind of the open secret or the not so open secret of the cinematic somehow operating there. And I hear it in your stuff about staging the public, which I think is really interesting. And then the other thing was also the stuff that you said about how fragmentation becomes mainstream, and that's where you introduced this idea of slow cinema as a kind of response or resistance to the fragmentation development. And I actually like that idea, but I also wanted to ask you what you thought about the similar idea, which I've thought about, which is the turn to kind of the monumental in cinema, like in Gravity is an example of that, or Von Trier's Melancholia, I think, is an example of that, where one response to the splintering and the small screens is to make movies that are just way too big to watch on a small screen. And it's exactly the opposite of what people were saying 10 years ago would happen. Like, as screens got smaller, people were saying like that the artistry of cinema would change to adapt to those smaller screens, you know, that was like the expectation. And instead, like, you know, some of that's happened in some places, but there's this kind of monumentalism, I think, among some filmmakers, almost as if to say, like, you can watch it on a tiny screen, but that's not watching this movie. Like, this movie demands that public space, that big screen. So that seems like part of a kind of dialogue with the screen on the part of the cinematic or something. So I don't know if that's a language you would want to use or how you would think about that.
Yeah, I will. I think on the first one about the movie theater, it deserves a lot. It deserves a lot of thought. But I will just mention this. Okay. In his kind of wonderful writings of the 1920s, a very different Krakauer, who was precisely the great critic and historian and analyst of the lower middle class German masses during this period, he has an essay called Cult of Distraction, Berlin's Picture Palaces. And there he finds precisely a kind of progressive aspect to the regressive architecture of the picture palace, precisely because it distracts from the centered fascination of the screen and makes the audience aware of that around it. And I think that's a little bit kindred, and, you know, so he's already looking while he sees, you know, the masses kind of being being gradually being made to acquiesce to fascism. He sees these other kinds of possibilities. And it's interesting that would be interestingly compared to Benjamin's notion of distraction in the famous notion of distraction in the Artwork essay and other places where Benjamin writes about it. So that's just one kind of suggestion there. In terms of monumental cinema, I think that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it. I think there's a big difference between Gravity and Melancholia. Okay, and I think in terms of, you know, there's a long history of mainstream cinema, and especially global Hollywood, as when there's a technological change, like when TV comes in, trying to make something bigger. You know, you get CinemaScope, the first wave of 3D films that were actually commercially distributed for a few years was in the 1950s. And I would be a little bit careful, you know, kind of in lumping together the, what I would call the sort of meta-biological elephantiasis of a film like Gravity, you know, with kind of Von Trier's corpus, which seems to me to exist on a different kind of register. And so there's that. And of course, a lot of these big screen films are just the top grossing films. They're just the ordinary action films. They're you know, they're all the superhero films, or the comic book films, and all these 3D films and so forth. So the fact that Gravity seems to take a kind of a more serious subject matter and have some kind of formal innovations, you know, makes it of interest. But it's a kind of a margin of that movement, in my judgment.